Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay. My name is Greg Scheurich. I am at the Fort Worth district. I was previously, quote unquote, the lead guy. I am currently occupying dual roles of the lead guy and another guy. But I would like to take this opportunity to talk to you briefly about renewables, discerning hope from nope. So I'm going just to assume that everyone chuckled heartily at this slide. This is an old standby for presentations for me. I enjoy it and it's truth. Okay, this is a smaller portion of a presentation I culled from a longer presentation I delivered late last year. So some of these figures are slightly dated, but I think substantially this still points to the truth in both energy consumption and renewables as a portion of energy consumption. I am not one to kill you with PowerPoint and speak to you, or that is read to you what's on the slides. I trust you are all literate, and so basically the slides are for your reference either during or after the discussion. So as I bounce around, just because I'm not speaking to what's precisely on the slide, it is generally related. So I would say don't think I'm crazy, but perhaps I am anyway. Basically, the world's a crowded place. Thomas Friedman wrote what I thought was a pretty decent book for a liberal, Flat, Hot, and Crowded, and it speaks to a lot of the trends that we're going to talk about here. But basically it is crowded, and it's going to get more crowded. And one of the things that's going to go hand in hand with that, in all likelihood, barring some massive economic meltdown worldwide, is that we're going to see a lot of people rising out of energy poverty, which really is the most fundamental form of poverty. A quick overview here about basically, and I know this is an odd metric, but I pulled it from the British Petroleum Annual Survey. It's a couple years old. They publish it every year. It's really interesting. It's very energy dense. If you have some time to wade through it, it's very enlightening. Basically, you can see that for the most part, energy usage aligns very strongly, positively with wealth of a nation. We're not the worst offenders, although this chart would tell you that we are. Small energy country or small energy resource rich countries like Qatar are worse. They can afford to turn the air conditioners on all the time. And Canada, a wealthy, smaller nation, needs to turn the heat on all the time. But we are at the top of the pile when it comes to energy usage. And if you look at the little calculations I've done in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that with just some nominal annual increases in energy usage coupled with anticipated population growth, you'll see doubling and or potentially tripling of energy required globally in the next 3.5 to 4 decades. That's a massive amount of energy that's going to be required. Now, looking at where this energy comes from currently, if this isn't obvious what this is showing, the top band is a general representation of all energy used. At the far right of that, the small colored bands are then blown up to the second row where you have nuclear, biomass, and hydro. And to the far right of that, you have some colored bands that are blown up again to show you really just how, at least at this point, nominal the contributions of renewable energy are. It's not to say that that's not something that shouldn't be or won't be explored, but it is to put into perspective just how little that currently is contributing to energy use worldwide. The crux of my conversation here today is going to be that no single solution, or there's not going to be a silver bullet here. It's going to be a combination of items. Now, a lot of you have probably seen slides like this one. This originated, I believe, from Searle, or at least my experience with it originated from Searle. And these numbers are intended to be more guides than actual firm hard numbers. But essentially what this slide is telling you is looking at the net lifetime cost at a facility relative to day one costs, operations and maintenance costs, and energy costs obviously would be a part of operations and maintenance costs. So what you have here is basically a sliding scale where, and I'm going to flip through this relatively quickly, you go from basically red dot, green dot, blue dot, purple dot, and these are locations on the cost curve relative to basically least amount of energy efficiency to most amount of energy efficiency. Now that's not value, that's energy efficiency itself. When you speak to value, you really want to have some combination, obviously, of initial investment, operations, and maintenance optimization. But then, obviously, the balance of that equation is going to be made up by, if you are speaking to the case of a net zero building or something similar, renewable energies, photovoltaics, concentrating solar thermal, wind, geothermal, biomass, those types of things. Looking to renewables themselves, well, there's a couple of examples here of some good buildings, and in fact, there was a recent publication, and I think it was DOE actually that put it out, about 52, I think it was 52 net zero buildings across the country, and it describes basically the same strategy that I'm advocating here, which is basically taking advantage of efficiencies that are not particularly good photo opportunities, things like caulk and insulation and properly aligning the building and things like that. The good photo ops, the turbines and the photovoltaic arrays, are really the last thing to be practiced. This is getting to be a little older now, the NREL facility, but it does compare rather favorably with other buildings that are not net zero that could be considered of the same caliber and certainly the same time frame built in the area. So the non-silver bullet, the combination solution that I would envision us having would be the efficiencies of the building itself. That's the first. The second one is going to be what's called dynamic pricing or demand response pricing. And basically what that is you've probably heard that there are smart meters now going in, basically everywhere. We had one installed at our house a few months ago. And I go outside and I see how much the kids are spending by leaving lights on and leaving fans on and leaving doors open and trying to air condition the outside. And then they wonder why I'm annoyed because, Dad, just go to the bank and get some more money to pay it. But really, what this type of situation affords us is to really flatten what was otherwise very peaky consumer responses before this type of technology was available. A good analogy here is dynamic pricing on tollways. And the example I give people when I talk about this is that here in Dallas we have a horribly congested highway, LBJ 635, that they're embarking on I think a $1.2 billion expansion. And what they have proposed is that there will be a tollway with a 40-mile-an-hour minimum speed. And people they don't believe that, but then I explained to them, well, it's going to be a minimum speed because they're going to jack up the tolls to $5 a mile at peak times. And you and I can sit in congestion overhead and stare down at the Lamborghinis and Ferraris racing by below that are able to pay that. The analogy there really does translate very well to electricity, and that is for folks who are willing to, let their thermostats drift a bit in the heat of the afternoon, for people that are willing to put off running the washing machine or running the dishwasher until after 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock, there's going to be dynamic pricing, and that's going to be a way to influence the consumer model such that we're able to take, you'll see the upper left is the peakiest, if you will, and this is an annual slide showing daily, weekly, monthly, and annual peaks. In the middle of the year, you'll see something along the lines of, this says July 25th. I would anticipate, somewhere around the last week of July, first week of August, you'd see the highest cost electricity, because that would correspond to the highest demand. Very basic law of economics, supply demand. What we would want to do with demand pricing is to suppress that peakiness and develop a cost curve that looks something more like this: rainbows and lollipops and puppy dogs and kittens and things like that. But what this affords us is, in lieu of a peak that would be somewhere up here that would require significant stranded plant capacity, and that's really where you wind up having the dirtiest fuels and the least efficient engines running, you eliminate that requirement, you reduce that demand, because you let people know that, hey, you can turn your air conditioner on, but instead of being 6 cents a kilowatt hour, it's going to be 30 cents a kilowatt hour or $1 a kilowatt hour. People are much more responsive to that, obviously. People tell me that they're green and that they are sustainable and that they're very environmentally conscious. And I believe that's true insofar as they can still have their hot showers and their cold beer. And this actually type of situation allows for a marriage of both of those philosophies, if you will. So the first two prongs of the solution are basically building an efficient building, but making it value conscious. Obviously, not driving the price per square foot to $400, $500, $600 a square foot to eke out a few more kilowatt hours per square foot year efficiency. The second is the demand response pricing, and the third one is renewables. The renewables you see most frequently are the ones that make for good photo ops, and those generally are PV arrays and wind turbines. What I am here to tell you is that I'm not a big fan of those. I see those on a location, and I think there's dollars that would have been better spent in just about any other capacity of the project, and I'll tell you why. There's something called capacity factor, and if you know what that is, then you're ahead of the curve for most people. And if you don't know what it is, I'm going to tell you what it is. Basically, if you have a nameplate capacity of any type of power generation equipment, for example, 1 megawatt, it's an easy number. Your 1 megawatt station has a capacity factor equal to the amount of power it did produce over the year divided by its nameplate capacity, which in this case would be, I think there's 8360 or something like that, hours in a year. So if you look at something like solar, it has a capacity factor generally around 15 to 20 to 25%. And the reason the solar, now this compares to, for example, a natural gas turbine or a cleaner burning coal turbine capacity factor or nuclear capacity factor of probably something north of 95%. And the reason the solar capacity factor is so low is pretty evident. Obviously, you have, first of all, at least 50% of the time night. In the equator, it's 50%, it's 12 hours day, 12 hours night. Year-round, as you move farther north and farther south in latitudes, you get greater variation in terms of solar insolation, the number of hours per day, and that cycles through the year. But basically, you couple that with cloud and weather patterns, and you get something along the lines of 15 to 20 to 25% at the very top. Now, this is on top of the fact that solar is pretty inherently inefficient. You're looking at something along the lines of 10 to 15% efficiencies. Some things are north of that yet. But the thing is, when you read about especially photovoltaics in solar, you need to be very careful when people are hyping advances in solar, because if they say things like, our arrays are 10% or 20% or 30% more efficient, it sounds really good. But if you start out with something that's 14% efficient and you increase its efficiency by 30%, you're still talking about something that's terribly, terribly inefficient. And on top of that inefficiency, there are other negatives to solar. It's still a relatively toxic manufacturing process. A lot of it is manufactured in China, as you would expect, and then it's trucked over here on diesel-burning cargo tankers. And then you have other problems. First of all, you have the cheaper the array, the less the efficiency, as you would expect. But beyond just the manufacturing process, you have, as you can see in the lower left, that's what's called a fixed axis array. Generally speaking, it points due south, and it's elevated. The degrees approximately equates to something just north of the latitude at which it's placed. Fixed axis means that it's fixed. It doesn't travel through the day as the sun does, and it has a lower efficiency because you get, especially in the early morning and late afternoon, you get these high incidences which result in lower efficiencies. You can have single array tracking, single axis tracking, which basically will track the sun as it travels east to west, and you can have dual axis tracking, which travels not only the east to west motion, but essentially the parabolic path that it carves through the sky in two axes and tracks the sun throughout the day. Each of these innovations does increase the efficiency and the output some, but you're still talking very low efficiencies overall. What you have in the upper left here is called solar thermal, concentrated solar thermal, and basically what this does is these are parabolic mirror arrays right here, and what they'll have is a hydronic medium passing through here. Lots of times eutectic salts or things like that, that the thermal energy of the sun is bounced off of these mirrors, and hits this heating medium here. And what you have then is, in lieu of, whereas the photovoltaic arrays generate DC, what you have here is you're obviously capturing the heat of the sun. And this in turn then acts much more like a standard engine turbine. What you're going to do is you heat up probably in a multi-cycle and generate your AC directly from mechanical energy from the steam powered from this heat, versus the AC here has to be generated through DC to AC conversion, and you can incur additional losses there as well. In addition to all those things that I don't like about solar, you have this thing called basic average solar insolation, not insulation, insolation across the United States. And what that means is basically people in the southwest United States enjoy a significant inherent advantage to the efficiency of solar as compared to people across the rest of the country. Now, take a look at this map, and then take a look at this map. Obviously, having significant solar density in the southwestern part of the United States does benefit Southern California, approximately and immediately. It doesn't do a whole lot for where still much of the country lives. And that problem is remedied only through transmission, and there's losses and stranded capital in those remedies to that as well. Obviously, I'm speaking to utility scale installation at that point, not residential scale. But when you're looking at the needs of an entire installation, you really are looking somewhere obviously between residential and utility scale, but more towards utility scale end. Wind, you have some of the same problems as solar in wind. You have the capacity factor issue, a little higher in wind than in solar. The problem in wind, though, is that you get your greatest availability of power as driven by wind at a time that's not exactly coincident with demand. Your solar incidence is highest when your power draw and demand is highest, late afternoon, early evening as temperatures peak in the summer in the northern hemisphere. Your wind, however, actually starts to peak later in the evening and overnight when the demand drops significantly. In addition to that unfortunate reality, what you see here is wind blows most where people live least. You'll recall the population density map. People live on the coasts and not in the plains. So again, as is the case with utility scale solar, the issue with wind is that the power that it generates has to be transmitted somewhere, has to be access has to be provided to a consumer base, and it's just not inherently built into where these wind farms make the most sense. This is a quick summary, and admittedly there are some rounding issues here. I have cited it, and you can look these things up, but basically what this chart speaks to is the fact that with the capacity factor, which actually causes your value of wind and solar to be reduced, you not only have that issue, you have your intermittency issue as well, and that speaks to your cold beer and your hot showers. People claim they're green until their air conditioners go off in the middle of summer, in the middle of the afternoon. I like recalling the story of a Simpsons episode where Homer decides they're going to go off the grid, and he installs a giant wind turbine in his backyard, and it works great for the first day or week or whatever. And then you get some dog days, and the wind dies down, and they're living without power. So Homer plugs in 100 fans to poor Ned's outlets, and he uses fans to blow his turbine. And while that is a hilarious envisioning of the concept, that is kind of what your problem with intermittency is. And really, you need almost 100% backup to these types of things at the utility level to ensure that demand can be met through utility generation. And so while it makes some sense, especially when you speak to not only the availability, but the incentives you get from utilities and from local, state, and federal governments, those things aren't really present for the military. They're not available for us, and thus the types of incentives that make payback for wind and solar be viable at a residential level or even a community level are really not present for us. What does make sense, however, that is completely renewable and is actually pretty ubiquitously available across the United States is geothermal. Now, the problem with geothermal is, to my estimation, twofold. The first is that it doesn't provide for great photo ops. You have to drill significant well fields. There are large upfront costs, and it's not nearly as scalable as wind or solar photovoltaic. You can put in a 500 watt or a 5 kilowatt photovoltaic array. You can put in, a 50 kilowatt wind turbine. You can't really put in a 50 kilowatt geothermal plant, because basically you have to drill a well field. What you're going to do is extract heat from the earth basically to drive turbines in the same manner that you would use coal blast furnaces or natural gas fired turbines or nuclear power to drive these turbines. And so you can't really set up a 50 watt or a 15 kilowatt geothermal plant. They have to be scaled up to fairly large numbers, and we're talking in the megawatt range, and really 2-digit 10 megawatts or larger before you really start seeing some advantageous cost situations that geothermal really does offer. Another problem is that it doesn't make a good photo op because it looks a lot like a standard utility situation, and you don't get that same tree huggy green feel from standing in front of, certainly not a drill rig that you would see, and probably not the same type of turbines that you would see at utility scale that are necessary. A lot of people have a mistaken notion that geothermal is really relegated to the western U.S., and that was the case in years gone by, and with standard geothermal resources. But in today's day and age, especially with the advantages we have from improved drill field technology from, ironically, oil and gas exploration, we know bottom hole temperatures, and we have significant drilling technology advances over where we were 15 or 20 years ago. And the system that would be used today would be called this EGS, Enhanced Geothermal System Resource Maps. And what you see really is, in lieu of looking at that top left map where you have really some isolated pockets in the western U.S. that can be used productively for geothermal, really what you have is, at depth and at 10 kilometers, it's certainly accessible by today's drilling technologies. This is the available resource, and it's something that can be used, obviously, to significant benefit in the western U.S., but really to benefit in almost any location. It is fairly ubiquitous. It becomes very cheap at scale. It is very competitive with coal at scale, which is basically the cheapest fuel there is now at the utility scale. It's certainly way, way cleaner than coal. It's even much cleaner than natural gas. I think that's one of our here's a slide indicating that, in fact, it will compete, at least theoretically from this Credit Suisse report, with our cheapest utility scale baseline production costs at present. Well, that's not good. I don't know where that went, but that here is, or was intended to be, our greenhouse gas emissions from geothermal usage. And basically what the slide did say before it disappeared is that, as you would expect, geothermal has very few emissions, certainly when compared to any of the existing utility scale fossil fuels that are in use, and really does compare very favorably as well, at least on a greenhouse gas metric, with solar and with wind, and obviously has significant advantages over either of those in that it is available as a baseline power producer. It does have the capacity to run at 95-98% capacity factor. It is relatively ubiquitously available. There are some downsides to it. There has been observed low-grade seismic activity in conjunction with geothermal usage. There are plants that have been open in Northern California, Northern Nevada since the 60s, and they have observed increased seismic activity, presumably in conjunction with those efforts. But they've been very low grade, nothing that's caused any damage, and they have not increased in intensity or frequency over time, as far as I've been able to discern from available information. So really what we have is, kind of as a wrap-up here, is that I'm not a huge fan of solar and wind, which I think you've probably been able to discern from this. I think there are applications for it. In fact, I think one of the best applications for solar would have been in advanced outposts in Iraq. There is significant documented evidence that fuel convoys were directly related to, obviously a number of attacks. They're slow moving, they're hard to defend, they're necessary, they're predictable, they're large. If we could have eliminated those with significant solar investment out there, that would have been an excellent opportunity for that. And there are still other locations where it makes sense. If you are significantly off-grid, if your need is somewhat small, not in the megawatt, but perhaps in the kilowatt area, there are storage applications that are available for that. But when you look at installation level, solar and wind and concentrating solar thermal are not ready to provide the type of baseline consistency that's required to support mission. Another renewable that hasn't been mentioned here is biomass. And there are some advantages to that, but there are also significant disadvantages. The one that comes to mind most readily in terms of mission support is you can't close gates to biomass. You can store a limited supply, obviously, on site, but that's something that does rely on continuous supply lines, basically, whereas geothermal is something that could be contained entirely within gates of an installation and still support mission. And then, of course, there are still disruptive technologies. We don't know what the future is going to bring. There could be something wonderful. I entertain the possibility that we will have fusion reactors someday. Very clean, super efficient, super energetic fusion reactors. Pons and Fleischmann, they didn't quite do it for us, but somebody at some point, I have no doubt, will. But until that time, there are other options to go with and other things I think we ought to be exploring. Here's where we came from. Here's where we're headed. And it's up to us to get there. And so, first of all, sorry for the delay in starting. We'll blame that on Ryan because he's not talking right now. Any questions? Ryan, are you on the line still?
I am here. I haven't seen any questions come in yet from the Q&A portal, but if people have any questions at this time, you can go ahead and type them in. If not, if you do have a microphone, there's a little guy raising his hand at the top. You can click that, it'll raise your hand, and I'll select on you when we're ready.
And this is my first webinar I've given, and I have to say that it is incredibly difficult. It's not difficult. It is impossible to discern how many people are following along, how many people are buying it, how many people are not. So that litmus is just not available in this environment. So I apologize for that. Okay, so I see. What is my opinion on solar PV versus concentrated Stirling? Well, Stirling's a demonstrated inefficient engine. It's been around for a long time. It's pretty neat to show your kids. You can hold some in your hand and it can move. I think definitely that concentrated solar thermal has advantages over PV in that, it's going to work when the sun goes behind the clouds. It has significantly greater capacity factor than does PV, but at the same time, it's much harder to install in terms of a more scalable size. You can't really install a 10 kilowatt or a 15 kilowatt concentrating solar thermal as easily as you can just slap a few arrays on top of a roof or on the ground next to your structure and have some inverters in your garage. So there are different applications for each. At utility scale, I definitely think concentrating solar thermal would be much more advantageous. All right, Ron, I don't know. Do I hit delete here? Looks like. Is DoD aggressively pursuing geothermal? If so, where? What I have seen is that it's not pursuing geothermal nearly aggressively as it is pursuing photovoltaics and wind. And from what I can tell, geothermal just doesn't have as good a lobby as photovoltaics and wind. To what I would describe that would be you basically have the same types of turbines that you use in gas and coal, and those folks are already getting their business there. Of course, I assume they would prefer to increase their business through that use. but I don't see that happening as yet. In fact, of renewable technologies, geothermal is at the very bottom of the list. The top, until very recently, was perhaps not surprisingly biofuels. I'm hoping with the economic situation coupled with the drought that farce will finally and at long last be discontinued, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Who's working on geothermal generation in the East? Actually, the geothermal information that I pulled was from an MIT report, I think from 2008. And that was done as a consortium of public, private, and academic. And in fact, one of the folks that was on the head of that group is a professor at SMU here locally, and I've had the opportunity to a couple of times exchange ideas with him, and he expresses the same frustration as I do in that it's really not something that's being pursued heavily as yet, and you know, when you look at strictly the physics of it, it absolutely makes sense 100%. It's a matter of inertia and lobbying and interests and the things that you typically do see as happening that thus far seem to be preventing that. Any projects in progress? There are geothermal projects in progress. Like I said, there have been things in California and in Nevada from the late 60s, and there are a few that are being developed right now. I didn't have a chance to check on the progress of those, but they are primarily out west to date as far as I know. What is the minimum bottom hole temperature for geothermal power plant? Okay, so getting into some of the actual technical requirements on enhanced geothermal. Obviously, the temperatures, the higher the temperatures you have, the better your plant efficiency and output is going to be. In terms of minimum bottom hole temperatures, I think they can actually make things work pretty well with some pretty dismal temperatures, things in the 180 degree range. I would have to do some more checking, but that MIT report I referenced is, while not an easy read, it is an excellent read, and it should be very easy to find. It was MIT every year for like the last 5 or 6 years has put out a report on a different energy topic, and I think it was around 2008 that they did enhanced geothermal systems, and it really is an excellent read. If you have an extra, I'd say put it by your bed, read 10 minutes every night, and it'll put you to sleep, but after 2 weeks you'll have it read. How many areas of geothermal fields exist, and don't they have the same issue with transporting the energy to others as different methods of generation? Actually, the one of the reasons that I think that geothermal is significantly more advantageous than concentrating solar or photovoltaics or wind is that basically you can do it anywhere. Now, you will have different bottom hole temperatures and you will have different drilling requirements. But if you're really looking at, an installation level or a utility level plant, the incremental cost to drilling another kilometer or 2 kilometers, while not insignificant, are not insurmountable, and it certainly is going to be A, less expensive, and B, less vulnerable not only to intentional disruption but unintentional disruption, storms, or you'll recall 2003, 4, the East Coast went down, that third of the United States, and that was just a cascade of improbable events. I remember sitting in the Houston airport when that occurred thinking, terrorist, and it wasn't. Well, at least it wasn't publicly acknowledged that it was. It was just a series of failures, one after another, a domino effect that caused that to happen. Geothermal basically can be done anywhere. It is going to be more a better value proposition probably farther west, but especially, again, as drilling technology improves and as that industry as a whole matures in this country, obviously we'll see economies of scale that will benefit the, a rising tide raises all ships type thing in that area. Do you include biomass and renewable? I actually culled it out of here. I said this was a shorter presentation from a longer one I had done previously, given at defense seminar, I forget where, but biomass does definitely have certain options and applications. The big problem I see in terms of military is that you can't close the gates to it, whereas you can with geothermal with baseline requirements, and to a lesser extent solar and wind as well. Julie Webster might point out the difference between geothermal and ground source heat pumps. Sure, absolutely. Geothermal, when I'm speaking about EGS, I'm speaking about basically electricity generation, whereas ground source heat pumps are really something that can be used very advantageously throughout the United States as well, and for the most part throughout the world, as a function of soil conductivity, soil conditions, surface area, where you are, but a ground source heat pump basically takes advantage of the somewhat constant temperature in the earth versus the fluctuating seasonal cyclical temperatures you see in any particular environment. Ground source heat pump basically is an air conditioning system with its source or sink coil underground or sometimes in water environments if available. And it will serve as exactly that, either a source or a sink, depending on the direction of the HVAC cycle and the requirements of the seasonal ambient temperatures. I see it was included by the Renewable. Is it? Oh, I don't know what that question is. Sorry. And just one more, it looks like. How long is a hole used for geothermal good to lose heat over time and need to be shut down to drilled again? That's for when you look at an enhanced geothermal system, basically you're kind of looking at the same type of technology as you are with fracking, basically. And over time, the fractures and the proppant used to open the fractures can need to be redone. You do, in oil and gas at least, do frequently, or at least occasionally, need to recomplete wells. That is a little different because you're relying generally on the pressure of the oil or gas play in the field, whereas in an enhanced geothermal system, you're not just developing oil and gas out of the ground, you're constantly pumping down a fluid and pumping back a fluid. So you presumably wouldn't have the same drop in pressure that you would see in an oil and gas situation. I don't really know a lot about the specific technology in terms of the drilling. I imagine there is certainly O&M considerations on the geothermal side as well, as you would see in any technology. You listed disruptive technologies, boombox, check into others, weren't familiar with them, wasn't sure if they were biomass. No, those were not biomass associated technologies. Those are just things that have seen their day in a magazine here or there and may well at some point prove to be interesting and helpful, or may just prove to be answers to Trivial Pursuit questions eventually.